Everyone in Hollowbrook knew the river kept secrets, but no one ever imagined it would give one back. The midsummer sun spilled a warm honeyed light over the quaint village of Blackwater Hollow, casting long slanting shadows that stretched lazily across the cobbled square like a secret waiting to be uncovered. The summer revel, the village's most anticipated event, had transformed the quiet green into a fluttering canvas of color and cheer, yet beneath the laughter and the scent of sugared almonds something felt misaligned. Striped tents flapped in the soft breeze like restless whispers, while the old brass band played a jaunty tune that didn't quite match the undercurrent of unease that laced the air. Children weaved chaotically between adults, their faces smeared with sticky toffee and excitement, but Miss Eliza Hargrave, seated in the shade outside the Hollow Hearth Tea-House, wasn't watching the fair through the eyes of nostalgia like everyone else. She was observing, calculating, noting the details that others brushed aside. Her eyes, clear and sharp despite her age, drifted from face to face, picking out expressions that didn't quite fit the setting. Mrs. Clarendon, the stony widow with the perfect posture and a past everyone politely ignored, stood near the milliner's booth, her fingers clenched so tightly around her gloves they trembled. Her stepson Harold, pretending to laugh with the local lads near the cider barrel, had the hunted look of someone with something to hide. Even Agnes Thorne, the innkeeper known for her brisk efficiency, moved like a woman carrying a weight she couldn't name. Her apron was askew, her forehead glistened with sweat that wasn't entirely from the summer sun, and her smile, when it came, was brittle. As she bustled over with a fresh pot of tea, her voice carried the sort of casual comment meant to be brushed aside but impossible to forget. "We had a guest last week, a Mr. Fenwick, kept to himself. Gentlemanly type, polite, paid through till Tuesday but left on Sunday night without a word. Didn't take his bag, didn't ask for his key, didn't even touch the last 2 meals he'd pre-ordered." She paused, as though hearing her own words for the first time, and added, "And the station master says no train tickets were sold under his name since." Edith Blanchfield, ever the cynic, waved her hand dismissively, blaming romance or drink, but Agnes didn't budge. "It's the way he looked, Miss Hargrave, like he'd already disappeared before he left." That phrase stuck, carved itself into Eliza's mind like the first line of a case yet to be written. Disappearances in sleepy towns didn't usually make noise, they echoed. They echoed in mismatched stories, in forgotten luggage, in glances exchanged too quickly. She stirred her tea slowly, each circle deliberate, as her eyes returned to the crowd. To Mrs. Clarendon's knuckles now white with tension, to Harold's sudden silence when he met her gaze, to Agnes's fingers shaking ever so slightly. These weren't coincidences, they were threads. And if there was one thing Miss Hargrave knew, it was how to follow a thread, until it unraveled everything it was meant to hide. As the music trilled, slightly offbeat now, and the fair spun on with its illusion of joy, she leaned back, eyes narrowed not in suspicion, but in certainty. "How very peculiar," she whispered, though not to herself. No, she said it to the wind, to the village, to the mystery already blooming quietly behind the bunting. He vanished, not gradually, not with a whisper of goodbye, or the soft trace of footprints in morning dew, but completely. Without his key, without his luggage, and without so much as a polite farewell, and as Miss Eleanor Morell stirred her tea with practiced elegance, the rhythmic tap of silver on porcelain echoed like a clock ticking toward something deeply unsettling. "Now isn't that rather peculiar?" she murmured aloud, eyes not on her companions but distant, already caught in the web of implications spinning silently in the room. Mrs. Partridge, still feverishly enthralled with tales of the vicar's wife, and a rumored nighttime visitor slipping through the rectory garden gate, barely registered the comment, but Miss Morell had already catalogued the inconsistencies in Mr. Lansbury's disappearance with the quiet precision of someone who had spent a lifetime mapping the contours of human behavior. People, she believed, knew, did not vanish into nothingness. Not without noise, not without traces. She leaned forward with the barest shift of posture, her voice low, sugar smooth, hiding the sharpness beneath. "Did you say, dear, that he left his luggage behind?" Mrs. Thorne, flustered and warm-faced from the kitchen heat, nodded while absently smoothing her apron. "Oh yes," she replied, glancing toward the stairs, as if the luggage might still be watching from above. And not just a bundle or satchel, a real trunk, leather-bound, polished, brass corners gleaming like new, still locked, still untouched. Miss Marple's nod was almost imperceptible, her mind now steadily pulling threads into patterns. "No letter, no note?" she asked softly. "Not a word," Mrs. Thorne confirmed, her voice barely a whisper now. "I even asked Tom at the station, just in case. He said no one of Mr. Lansbury's description bought a ticket. Said the last time he saw him, he was walking toward the river path alone, just before dusk." Miss Marple blinked slowly. "To the river," she echoed, but didn't press it. "Not yet," Mrs. Partridge scoffed, dabbing her lips with her napkin. "He's a man, isn't he? Probably ran off with some floozy from the next town over. These men, always restless, never mindful of the chaos they leave in their wake." But Eleanor Marple heard what wasn't being said, the strange stillness in the air, since his absence, the silence where curiosity should have bloomed. She thought of the trunk again. A man might forget a hat, even a wallet in a rush, but not an expensive trunk packed with care, and certainly not without settling his bill, especially one as neat and quiet as Mr. Lansbury. No, this was different, deliberate, controlled, or possibly orchestrated. She rose that afternoon with quiet resolve, and began her familiar circuit of the fairgrounds, weaving herself between stalls like a thread, in the village's living fabric, gathering pieces where others saw only frayed edges. She chatted about weather and flower shows, about jam recipes and church attendance, but behind every smile was a hunt for gaps. A word here from Mrs. Longley at the post office, no forwarding address. A casual remark from Mr. Tibbins at the tobacconist. Mr. Lansbury hadn't come in for his usual tobacco the day he vanished. Edith Henderson at the Red Hart confided that his room still smelled faintly of shaving soap and lemon, the signs of a man who expected to return. And yet, not a single soul remembered seeing him leave. No packed carriage, no goodbyes, no footprints. It was as if he had been plucked from the world by invisible hands in the space between breath and silence. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the bakery stall, selected a currant bun with slow precision, then asked the girl, wrapping it, "Did the gentleman at the inn ever seem troubled?" The girl hesitated, eyes flicking toward the ground. "Not really, miss," kept to himself. "Polite. But," she trailed off, fingers tightening slightly around the paper. "Mrs. Thorne said he received a letter, just the day before. It unsettled him. Went pale, looked shaken." Eleanor's breath caught behind her smile. A letter, a reaction, then disappearance. Now that was a sequence. She thanked the girl, took the bun, and stepped away, her pulse steady, her mind racing. Someone had written something that shook him, something powerful enough to either drive him away, or silence him completely. And the worst part, in a village that never missed a flickering light or a newcomer's name, no one seemed truly bothered by the fact that Mr. Lansbury had vanished into thin air, almost as if they'd been instructed, or conditioned, not to be. "It's not that I make a habit of poking into guests' affairs," Mrs. Calloway whispered, her voice barely audible over the creaking of the old inn's timbers, "but something about how Mr. Duval disappeared. It gnaws at me, Miss Elspeth." The afternoon light streamed through the lace curtains like tired memories, and Elspeth Alden, quiet and composed in her dark violet coat, nodded slowly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "A man may forget a scarf in haste, even a book, but seldom his suitcase, and never his dues," she replied, her voice even, but her mind already unraveling threads. "You say he only paid for the first 2 nights?" Mrs. Calloway swallowed, then nodded. "He said he'd pay the rest at the end of the week," said it with confidence too. But the end, well, the end never came, and no one saw him leave. Not George at the stables, not Elsie who brings in the firewood, and not even old Mr. Renner who sits by the front window from dawn to dusk, and swears he sees everything that moves in the square. Elspeth's gaze darkened slightly. "And his room?" Mrs. Calloway hesitated, then led her up the narrow staircase, each step groaning under the weight of unanswered questions. The door to room 4 creaked open, and a strange chilled stillness met them, the kind that only hangs in places untouched for days. The bed was neatly made. A book, Wuthering Heights, lay open face down on the nightstand, its pages frozen mid-sentence, as though the reader had intended to return at any moment. A pair of polished shoes sat side by side beneath the chair, trousers folded atop it, and beside the wardrobe, a heavy suitcase remained locked and unmoved. "Nothing's been disturbed," Mrs. Calloway murmured. Even the shaving brush was still wet the morning he vanished. Elspeth stepped further in, her eyes scanning for what wasn't there. On the writing desk, a blotter bore the faint pressure of a pen, but no ink had spilled, no letter was left behind. She traced the indent with a gloved finger. "He tried to write something," she whispered, but either changed his mind, or was interrupted. She pulled open the top drawer of the desk, empty but dusted. The second held neatly stacked letters, none opened, but the third resisted. "It's locked," Mrs. Calloway said, voice low, almost trembling. "I didn't want to force it. It felt wrong." Elspeth nodded, her eyes never leaving the drawer. If he locked it and didn't take it with him, it meant he planned to come back, but something, or someone made sure he didn't. Mrs. Calloway went pale. "You think he?" Elspeth turned toward her, her gaze unreadable. "I think whatever was inside that drawer may answer what happened outside this room." She moved toward the window and peered down. A narrow alley stretched beside the inn, shrouded in shadow even at midday. "Did anyone hear anything that night?" Mrs. Calloway shook her head. "No screams, no footsteps, just nothing." Elspeth stepped away, her expression now grave. "That's precisely what bothers me," she murmured. "When a man vanishes without a struggle, without noise, and without a witness in a house full of people, it usually means the noise came after he was gone, or that it was never made at all." She glanced once more at the locked drawer, then back at the open book on the nightstand. The page was still marked by the faint scent of lavender and ash, a strange mixture, a deliberate one. There was something in this room, in this silence, that hummed with unfinished intent, not the absence of a man who left, but the hollow where someone was taken, and the world below simply continued, unaware that it had swallowed someone whole and digested the evidence before morning. The mist that clung to the crooked edges of Elmbrook Lane that morning was not merely a remnant of the night's rain, it was heavier than dew, colder than fog, and far too still, like something holding its breath. It drifted low across the cobbled paths like an omen, creeping around boots and doorways with deliberate caution, and in that thick hush, the village of Elmbrook seemed to listen. Miss Alira Wren, known quietly among the locals as a woman who noticed what others politely ignored, felt the shift before anyone else. It was in the peculiar way greetings were offered, a beat too slow, a glance too quick, how shopkeepers fumbled with change, and how every pair of eyes seemed to steal anxious looks toward Carswell House, the old, ivy-choked manor, perched at the edge of the woods like a sleeping thing best left undisturbed. They said a writer, Elias Norwood, had taken up residence there, an urban man with tired eyes, and too many stories in his head. He came to finish a novel, they said, seeking solitude. For 21 days, he walked the forest trails before dawn, jotting hurried notes into a battered black notebook, barely nodding to anyone he passed. He never joined for tea at the square, never lingered in the shops, never spoke unless spoken to, and then only briefly, like his voice hadn't quite caught up with his thoughts. Then on the morning of the 22nd day, he was simply gone. Not just gone, but erased. No luggage missing, no carriage called, no footprints in the garden's damp soil. His coat still hung by the door, his spectacles rested on a book of ghost stories near the fire, and a teacup chipped on the rim, sat cold on the windowsill, filled halfway with Earl Grey, and a single dried petal of lavender floating on the surface. But it was the diary that drew the most unease. Open on his writing desk, its final page was half burned, the flames halted abruptly, as if swallowed by something that didn't want the words consumed entirely. The edges were brittle and blackened, the ink smeared and dripping as though it had wept itself from the page. At the bakery, Mrs. Finn murmured behind her sugared scones that Norwood had started talking to shadows the week before, arguing like someone was answering back. Mr. Bellamy at the post office added that Elias received identical brown envelopes each Tuesday. No return address, no markings save for a faint crescent pressed into the wax seal. "The last one," he said, "was returned unopened." Said the man no longer lived there, he recalled, tapping his temple as if it was a riddle no one had solved. That was when Alira decided to act. She visited Carswell House, pretending to inquire after a borrowed novel, but her real aim was the study. The door was different now, reinforced with a bolt that locked from the inside. Odd, she thought, since no one had been inside since Elias vanished. She spoke with Mrs. Anstruther, the housekeeper, a pale, quiet woman, whose hands never stopped ringing. There were voices, she admitted under her breath, late that night. One was his, the other, I've never heard before, deeper, mocking. She swallowed hard, and then a sound like something heavy collapsing. But when she checked the next morning, nothing was out of place. Nothing, except a smell. Elira could still recall it vividly, an unnatural blend of scorched cedarwood and dying roses, the kind of scent that didn't belong to any living memory. There was more. Tucked behind the scorched pages of the diary was a slip of parchment, yellowed and brittle with age, bearing just 8 words in frantic ink-blotted scrawl. Some stories are never written, only buried alive. That night, back in her sitting room, Elira couldn't sleep. She sat with the note on her lap, the candlelight flickering as wind whispered against the windows, not like weather, but like someone pacing just outside, waiting. She thought of Elias, not as a man who fled, but as someone who had been silenced, consumed by a story that did not want to be told. Carswell House had not just housed him, it had watched him, and when the manuscript came too close to whatever truth lay buried in its walls, it had swallowed the author whole. The ink stains on the wall weren't just accidents, they were warnings, and as the clock struck midnight and the faint sound of a typewriter echoed where there should have been silence, Elira understood with icy certainty that this mystery wasn't over. It had merely found a new observer, and perhaps, very soon, it would require a new author. It began with the quiet, almost ghost-like return of Eleanor Hargrove to Windmere Hollow, a woman once etched into the village's memory as the radiant daughter of the Hargrove estate, now reappearing like a shadow dragged back by time itself. 15 years had passed since the tragic and unsolved death of her father, Alistair Hargrove, whose body had been found at the foot of the staircase inside the grand but crumbling manor, a death officially marked as accidental, though whispered rumors told a darker tale. The scandal had driven Eleanor away, her departure abrupt, her silence louder than any denial. Now she stood once again behind the rusting gates of Hargrove Manor, veiled in black, eyes hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, expression unreadable, but posture calm as ever, composed like a woman who had not returned by choice, but by compulsion. She spoke to no one, declined all invitations, and seemed to vanish within the mansion's ivy-choked walls before the afternoon sun could settle. Yet the house, which had long stood dormant like an open wound on the edge of Windmere Hollow, began to stir with quiet unease. Lights flickered in rooms that had no electricity restored. At dusk, the villagers swore they heard piano notes drifting through the trees, low, discordant and hesitant, like the ghost of a melody trying to remember itself. Miss Thorne, the vicar's sister, whispered of voices echoing near the hedgerow at midnight, disjointed words rising sharply, like an argument that ended in sudden terrible silence. Eleanor was often seen walking alone along the mist-laced path behind the manor, her gloved hands holding what looked like a faded letter, her lips moving soundlessly as though reciting names. But the most unnerving accounts came from those who entered the house. Young Tom Haskett, who delivered groceries, said he glimpsed Eleanor seated in the drawing room, speaking softly to a figure seated across from her. Except when he entered, there was no one else there, no extra chair, no second teacup, just Eleanor, who turned to him slowly, offered a faint smile, and thanked him as if nothing had been amiss. Corwin, the long-time housekeeper, confessed to Miss Elsbeth in hushed tones that she'd found Eleanor staring into a mirror on the upper floor, motionless, her breath fogging the cracked glass. That same mirror, untouched since Alistair's death, was now fractured clean through the center, splitting any reflection into jagged halves. In that same room, Corwin discovered the late Mr. Hargrove's study exactly as it had been left, a coat slung over the chair, books open on the desk, even a half-finished glass of brandy. But most disturbing was the message scrawled into the dust on the window pane from the inside, as though written by trembling fingers, "Not her, never her." And then came the matter of Simon Bell, the estate solicitor, who had arrived one morning for legal affairs, and was never seen again. His car remained parked near the Crooked Oak, the passenger door left ajar, keys dangling in the ignition, leather case still inside. Eleanor claimed he'd decided to walk home, but the hollow had no roads leading away, only paths that circled back, and no one saw him return. Days turned into weeks, and the unease thickened. Eleanor was seen less and less, the manor's shutters drawn tightly, no signs of life beyond the soft flicker of candlelight behind the curtained windows. Then one morning, a shutter blew open during a storm, and a neighbor swore they saw Eleanor's silhouette standing by the cracked mirror, still, unmoving, as though waiting. When Inspector Vale finally obtained permission to investigate, the manor was cold, silent, untouched, except for one room, the drawing room, where a fresh cup of tea still steamed beside an open leather-bound journal. The last page, written in deliberate strokes, read, "The house remembers, the truth returns, and now, so have I." Eleanor Hargrove was never found, no trace of departure, no carriage seen, no luggage moved. Yet each year, on the anniversary of her return, the manor's mirror clears itself for 1 hour, reflecting not what stands before it, but something, or someone, trapped behind it, staring back. The village of Greystone Vale, tucked between forgotten hills and fog-draped moors, held within its crooked lanes a silence that felt less like peace and more like a breath held too long. The sudden reappearance of Eleanor Price, after nearly 20 years, without warning or explanation, was enough to rattle even the most stoic of villagers, but it was her unnerving poise that disturbed Miss Hargrave most. Eleanor stood outside the Hollowbrook Inn like someone resurrected from an unfinished story, her suitcase immaculate, her gloves spotless, her eyes too quiet to be innocent. She claimed to be passing through, searching for old memories, yet every word she spoke felt weighed and measured, her every glance betraying a nervous choreography rehearsed long ago. When the name Dr. Nathaniel Brant surfaced, the historian who had arrived weeks earlier, to study the sealed crypt beneath the ruined cathedral, and vanished without so much as a farewell, Eleanor's mask cracked, if only for a heartbeat. Her hand froze mid-gesture, her breath snagged in her throat, and she blinked too slowly. "I don't believe I had the pleasure," she said with an awkward grace, her gaze lowering as she began smoothing the fabric of her skirt with such obsessive precision that it seemed less like grooming, and more like an act of self-preservation. Miss Hargrave said nothing, only tilted her head, owl-like, as if studying the subtle ripples in Eleanor's carefully still surface. "Curious," she murmured. "Several people were quite certain they saw you speaking with him outside the churchyard the morning before he vanished." Eleanor's throat twitched, just once, and her breath caught with the quiet panic of a woman who suddenly realizes her secret is no longer safe. Then with swift but unnatural composure, she straightened her spine, and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If you'll excuse me, I really must be going," she whispered, her voice far too calm for a woman supposedly confused and innocent. Miss Hargrave stepped aside wordlessly, watching as Eleanor hurried down the stone path, her footsteps too quick, too uneven, shoulders drawn up like a woman bracing for impact. That night, the candle in Eleanor's attic room burned long into the early hours, and Mrs. Bellamy, the innkeeper, later confessed to hearing hushed, agitated voices from behind the door, though no guest had entered or left. The next morning Miss Hargrave visited Edmund Fielding, the village postman whose memory was as precise as his route. Over a quiet cup of tea by the sorting desk, she inquired casually about Dr. Brant's correspondence. Edmund nodded slowly. "There was a letter," he said, tapping his temple. "Thick paper, sealed, came from London, Bramble Court, Parsons Lane if memory serves. No name but the envelope. Something about it didn't sit right." Not the sort you get from a friend. It looked official, and it was returned the very next day. Unopened. Miss Hargrave's fingers curled gently around the handle of her handbag. Returned, she asked softly. By whom? Edmund blinked. Mrs. Bellamy said Dr. Brandt left in the night, just vanished. No note, no bags. Room left untouched except for a smear of dust on the floorboards and a cracked window latch. Intrigued and unsettled, Miss Hargrave walked to the post office where old Mr. Latham, a man obsessed with categorization and quiet order, welcomed her with the same reverence he gave to first editions. She inquired about the returned envelope, and after a moment of rummaging through the undeliverables bin, he handed it to her. A sealed missive marked only with a deep red insignia embossed onto the wax, a serpent devouring its own tail. Her fingers tingled as she traced it. Curious symbol, Latham remarked absently. Reminds me of something I once saw in the old cathedral archives. Miss Hargrave said nothing but felt a chill rise through her bones. That evening, Eleanor Price vanished without a trace, her suitcase still sitting in the corner of her room, unopened, its contents untouched, save for a single item, an old newspaper clipping folded into a book of Psalms, dated 19 years ago. Headlined Archaeologist Killed in Cathedral Collapse, Wife Missing. On the inside of her bedroom window, written in moisture where no moisture should have been, were the words, "He found it. It never sleeps." From that night onward the villagers began locking their doors before sunset, the cathedral remained permanently barred, and the red candle in Miss Hargrave's study burned steadily, night after night, as she opened a fresh page in her journal and wrote, "Some disappearances are the work of man, others the echo of what was never meant to be unearthed. I believe we've awoken the latter," and Eleanor knew. News has a curious way of moving in places like Elmridge Hollow, never shouted, never broadcast, just whispered from one teacup to the next, sliding beneath doorways like a chill draft that no one admits feeling. It began with a silence, the kind that grows noticeable only after it's settled too long. A guest at the Wrenbury Inn had vanished, not with fanfare, nor with farewell, but with the kind of absence that felt deliberate, unsettling. No note, no payment, not even a forgotten comb or a scrawled apology. Miss Adeline Crowther heard about it 3 days after the fact, when Mr. Tibbet, the long-nosed postmaster, shuffled into her parlor under the pretense of delivering a late package. "Strange business," he muttered, adjusting his collar. He left behind his correspondence, but not much else. Her eyes sharpened though her smile remained soft. "No return address?" she asked, casually, her fingers pausing mid-tea pour. Mr. Tibbet nodded gravely. "Only an address in Knightsbridge, 12 Wexford Place." The envelope was thick, expensive, cream-colored, embossed seal, typewritten, but formal, not like the usual circulars. Miss Crowther said nothing for a moment, only folded her napkin with precise fingers. A legal letter then, possibly a summons, or a notice, or worse, an inheritance. Her mind drifted to an old name, Harrow and Klein, solicitors known for discreetly managing estates tangled in scandal, bloodlines, or contested wills. She wrote to her contact in London, and the reply came swift. Harrow and Klein had indeed sent correspondence from Wexford Place recently, tied to the long-dormant Beechcroft estate, namely, a name she hadn't heard in 20 years. Thomas Beechcroft, a recluse, vanished, presumed dead. Ashridge Manor had stood empty ever since, shutters creaking like bones in the wind, said to be haunted not by ghosts but by guilt. And now, a man matching Beechcroft's likely heir had arrived unannounced in Elmridge Hollow, and disappeared just as quietly. Then came the body, found in the narrow brook behind the mill, waterlogged and pale, his face turned skyward like he'd been looking for something just beyond reach. It was a group of children who spotted him, and by the time Miss Crowther reached the scene, half the village stood behind yellowed hedgerows, their murmurs thick with superstition. The constable was quick to call it accidental, a slip, a stumble, perhaps drink, but she had seen the bruises, faint but precise. The watch on his wrist was old gold, engraved faintly. To TB. May justice find you. And justice, she thought, rarely arrived uninvited. In her parlor that evening, she laid out what little was known. One man vanished before speaking. One letter, unopened and sealed with the Beechcroft crest. One estate, long cursed by misfortune, and one woman, Mrs. Ellison, the old housekeeper at Ashridge, who had confessed half in dream that a man had stood at the manor gates 3 nights prior, staring into the windows, as if remembering a life he was never allowed to live. Miss Crowther's mind pulsed with patterns, old secrets, unspoken blood ties, and a truth that had been buried alongside the Beechcroft name. Someone in the village knew why that man had died, someone had watched him arrive, someone had made certain his past, and whatever claim it carried, never reached the surface. She believed with growing certainty that Elmridge Hollow was not the sleepy village it pretended to be, and if she pulled hard enough on this thread, she would unravel something far older, and far darker, than anyone dared admit. A damp hush had settled over Dovetail Creek, like a secret too heavy for the morning fog to carry alone. Mist clung to the ground in languid coils, winding between the boots of anxious onlookers, who stood at the edge of the water, as though the current itself might whisper some terrible confession. Constable Wren, visibly unsettled, adjusted his cap for the 3rd time, barking soft orders he clearly didn't expect anyone to while villagers murmured behind gloved hands, and exchanged glances thick with both fear and fascination. Mrs. Calloway, stiff with anxiety, hovered beside Miss Eleanor Vale, whose eyes, sharp and unflinching beneath her modest hat, had already taken in more than anyone else dared notice. "Awful affair," Mrs. Calloway muttered, her voice trembling like her shawl in the breeze. "Slip, they'd say. Moss near the bend's wicked this time of year." But Eleanor wasn't looking at the moss, she was looking at the shape beneath the rough woolen blanket, a shape that spoke more of stillness than sleep. She noted how the blanket had been placed, not tossed, how the angle of the limbs beneath it suggested not collapse but careful arrangement. And the boots, those boots, polished to a near mirror shine, not a speck of creekbed muck along the sole, the leather crisp, untouched by the damp embrace of the riverbank. No accident, her instincts whispered. Not even close. Dr. Felton, the village physician with his thinning hair and a reputation for discretion, rose from where he had been crouched beside the body, his brow glistening, and his voice too rehearsed. "Terribly unfortunate," he declared. "A misstep most likely. Lost his balance in the dark, perhaps." His words floated, unfinished, and Eleanor stepped closer, voice quiet but firm. "Have you determined the time of death, doctor?" There was the faintest flicker, hesitation almost invisible, but she caught it, the way one might catch a liar, blinking in a game of cards. "Difficult to say," he admitted finally. "The water interferes with, well, it's likely been a day. Or 2. Exactly the window in which Mr. Oswald Finch, the elusive clerk from the city, had vanished after only 1 night at Caraway Hall, last seen with his satchel and an unreadable expression. Now here he lay, pale and water-bloated, but strangely clean, a faint dark bruise visible just beneath the ear, a mark that no drowning could make. That evening, after the constable had retreated, and the sun had faded into a bruised lavender sky, Eleanor made her way to Dr. Felton's surgery under the pretense of concern. She found him on the back step, lighting a pipe with fingers that didn't quite obey his commands. "I trust you've recovered from the shock of the morning?" she asked gently. He nodded, but the smoke from his pipe curled away like a nervous sigh. "These things, they happen, do they?" she murmured, tilting her head. "Odd, don't you think, how his boots were so clean? Almost as if he was never on the bank at all." Silence, a beat too long. "Perhaps the current washed them," he said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "And the bruise?" she asked. "On the temple, blunt, angled, not the kind you'd get falling sideways into a stream." His grip tightened on the pipe. "Miss Vale, I assure you," she gave a soft, unreadable smile. "Of course, doctor." And with that, she left him alone with his smoke and his secrets. By the time the whispers of the man's death reached Caraway Hall, they clung to the drapes and corridors like smoke from a slow-burning fire. The servants spoke in hushed fragments, their footsteps quieter than usual, their eyes darting. Lady Thorne, proud widow of Colonel Thorne and mistress of the hall, sat in her drawing-room staring at an untouched cup of tea, the porcelain rattling faintly against its saucer in her trembling hand. Her face, normally composed with aristocratic detachment, now looked drawn, as though the foundations of her world had shifted an inch too far. "He was just a clerk," she whispered when Eleanor arrived. "An auditor. I scarcely knew the man." But Eleanor noticed the slip was not his, spoken before any confirmation had arrived. Her eyes scanned the room, the heavy curtains drawn shut, the faint, dark streak on the hearthrug that had been scrubbed but not quite erased, and a ledger left carelessly beneath a stack of correspondence, half concealed, bearing the name Finch and Cargill, with ink not yet fully dry. It wasn't grief she saw in Lady Thorne's eyes. It was dread. The kind of dread that roots itself not in mourning, but in guilt. "It's strange, isn't it?" murmured Miss Elspeth Rowan, her words soft as mist curling through the still air of Greystone Hollow. "How death never knocks, just slips in unannounced and alters everything in its quiet wake." Across from her, seated unnaturally rigid in a sunlit drawing-room that now felt far too cold, Mrs. Agatha Pelham blinked rapidly. The porcelain teacup, trembling slightly in her gloved hands. She had always been composed, always the dignified matron of the village, but at the mention of Mr. Harland Graves, her composure cracked ever so slightly. The brief hitch in her breath, the almost imperceptible flicker in her eyes, fear perhaps, or a memory clawing its way back from the recesses of her conscience. "Ah yes," she stammered, fingers tightening on the delicate china. "A dreadful accident, of course." But Miss Rowan had already noted the way her gaze shifted to the window, as if she feared being watched. "An accident indeed," Elspeth said mildly, though her head tilted ever so slightly, her eyes sharp beneath her gentle smile. "Odd, though, that you seem so deeply affected. Did you know Mr. Graves personally?" For the briefest heartbeat, something raw flashed through Mrs. Pelham's expression, guilt, regret, before she shook her head a shade too quickly. "No, not well, only in passing. He was quiet, kept to himself." Elspeth let the silence breathe then, letting it grow heavy and uncomfortable, the way only silence can when too much is left unsaid. Outside, a crow shrieked, and somewhere in the distance, the village church bell struck 4, a sound that made Mrs. Pelham flinch just slightly. "It must be unsettling," Elspeth said, voice low and even, "knowing that he was here, breathing the same air, and now simply not." The older woman gave a tight nod, but her fingers had gone white against the teacup's rim. "Yes," she whispered, her throat tight. "Unsettling." Then, as if the words could no longer stay buried, she added with a strained, trembling voice, "One moment someone is part of the world, and then just a void. That absence becomes louder than presence ever was." Elspeth leaned forward slightly, resting a gentle hand on the other woman's trembling knuckles. "Yes, my dear, and sometimes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that void isn't left by chance, but by intent." There, a tremor beneath Mrs. Pelham's skin, a tightening of her jaw. She pulled her hand back slowly, silently, and did not ask what Elspeth meant. She didn't need to. That evening, as fog rolled in over the village like a memory no one wanted to remember, news emerged that Mr. Linley, the loyal and meticulous butler of Greystone Hall, had disappeared without warning. "Vanished," whispered Miss Vera Cadell, over a half-forgotten tea. "Left his duties mid-week. No goodbyes, not even a note." Elspeth stirred her cup slowly, eyes fixed on the swirling motion. "That doesn't sound like Mr. Linley," she said. "He was loyal to a fault." "Too loyal," Vera murmured, glancing toward the door, as if worried it might creak open on its own. "He'd been different lately. Quiet, watching everyone, as if he knew something he wasn't meant to know." The following morning, under the veil of a polite visit, Elspeth made her way to Greystone Hall. Dora, the timid housekeeper, answered with reddened eyes, and a voice barely audible. He wasn't sleeping, she confided. Locked himself in the pantry at night. Whispered about a drawer. Said it didn't belong. That it was hiding something no one should ever see. What drawer? Elspeth asked, already knowing the answer. In Mr. Graves' study, Dora said, glancing toward the stairs. It was locked. He said he tried every key in the house. Said it was never meant to be opened. Then, he was gone. Later that day, Elspeth found herself standing in that very study, untouched since the man's sudden disappearance. Dust motes floated like whispers in the dim afternoon light, and the heavy silence pressed down like a weight. The drawer sat nestled in the center of the ornate desk, its brass handle polished, its lock gleaming unnaturally. There was a key, Mrs. Pelham said from behind her, voice low. He carried it, but it broke. Elspeth knelt slowly, examining the keyhole. Scratch marks, new and desperate, scarred the wood around it. Someone had tried to force it open. Had they succeeded? Had they hidden something, or removed it? She stood again, heart thudding. Curious, she said softly. For a drawer no one used, it's drawn an awful lot of attention lately. And as she turned back toward the empty room, one thing settled deep within her like ice in her bones. Harland Graves hadn't died in an accident. Linley hadn't fled without cause. Something long buried, and dangerously close to being unearthed, had stirred. And whoever was pulling the strings was still watching, still waiting, still inside these walls. Miss Eleanor Blackwood stood silently in the stale, dim air of the Whitcroft estate's forgotten study, a place abandoned by time yet bloated with unspoken truths. The floorboards beneath her boots groaned softly, as if protesting the intrusion, and a single draught whispered through a cracked window pane, carrying with it the scent of mildew and old secrets. In her gloved hand the ornate iron key, cold, rust-stained, and oddly intricate, refused to cooperate with the drawer's stubborn lock. She twisted gently then firmly, but as expected, it did not turn. She paused, tapping her finger to her chin, her eyes narrowing, mind whirring with deductive rhythm. If this wasn't the right key, then either the drawer had never been meant to open, or someone had made sure it wouldn't. And if Mr. Thaddeus Greaves had hidden the true key, it could only mean he knew he was being watched, or hunted. She scanned the room methodically. The desk was an ocean of ordered chaos, its surface littered with yellowed letters, antique quills, and the ghost of a coffee cup stain. But her eyes locked on the bookshelf beside it, specifically on a row of uncharacteristically dull encyclopedias on 18th-century maritime trade routes. She stepped closer, fingers sliding behind them with precision born of instinct, until she felt the envelope, folded twice, sealed with dust, and unnervingly cold to the touch. Inside a single, heavier key, smooth from handling and stained with faint fingerprints. Heart thrumming, she inserted it into the drawer's lock. It turned with a reluctant groan, and the drawer creaked open like an exhale from the past. Beneath decoy papers and purposefully mundane receipts, a single object lay waiting. A leather-bound journal, its cover scarred with time, and the initials TG carved with almost violent pressure, as though desperation itself had etched them in. Eleanor opened the cover slowly, and her breath caught in her throat. Scrawled across the first page, in neat but urgent penmanship, were the words, "The Whittaker inheritance, what they buried to keep me silent." As she flipped through its brittle pages, each entry unraveled a timeline of betrayal, handwritten notations, transcribed conversations, and even photocopied fragments of older conflicting versions of the will. At the center of this storm, Archibald Whittaker, a man whose public generosity had masked private sins. But Thaddeus' notes made one truth alarmingly clear: he was not just a historian or legal researcher, he had blood ties to the estate, and he had evidence that he had been erased from its legacy. One entry sent shivers down Eleanor's spine. Original draft names me primary heir. Final version, no mention. Last amendment executed while Archibald was bedridden. Witness signatures forged or missing. Confront Fairfax discreetly. That name, Fairfax, the family's solicitor, the same woman who had hired Eleanor under the guise of cataloguing heirlooms and estate documents. It wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. Eleanor turned to the journal's final page, and froze. The entry named her. B. Blackwood, brought in by Fairfax to manage archives. Skilled, unsuspecting, must not discover connection between her lineage and mine. She may unknowingly hold final proof, photograph in attic trunk. The journal slipped slightly in her trembling hands. She wasn't just cataloguing someone else's story, she was part of it. As the realization pierced her like ice, the grandfather clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the empty halls like funeral bells, and then, a sound subtle, but unmistakable, the slow deliberate creak of a floorboard behind the bookshelf. Not from the house settling, not from memory, from someone who knew she had found the truth, and who might do anything to ensure she never left the room alive. Miss Alara Vance remained motionless in the velvet armchair of the aging Carraway Manor, the low rustle of wind beyond the stained glass windows, barely masking the storm that had begun to gather inside these walls long ago. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the portraits of long-dead patriarchs, whose legacies loomed larger than their deeds ever had. She had not come for gossip or social calls. No, Alara came when the stories got quiet, when the air grew heavy with secrets that refused to stay buried. Across from her, Lady Evelyn Carraway, once the formidable matriarch of a family known for its prestige and discretion, now looked impossibly fragile, her eyes distant, voice nearly a whisper as it waded through years of repression. My husband provided for him, not openly, but with guilt-driven generosity, she confessed, her fingers twisting a delicate lace kerchief. Money sent in secret, letters unsigned, promises made in private, and then, when the doctors told him the end was near, he changed. He said the boy deserved more than silence. He changed his will. Alara's gaze didn't flinch. She already knew. The boy, Everett Hayes, had lived most of his life unaware of his true bloodline. He'd believed himself forgotten, only to uncover decades later that he had been hidden, not lost. But 3 months before Albert died, Leonard made sure it was undone. Evelyn's words dropped like stones into a still lake. Alara inhaled slowly. Because Leonard discovered the truth, a tremor passed through the old woman's frame. Yes, he confronted his father in a fury, said it would ruin us. That scandal would consume the name he spent his life protecting. He told Albert that no bastard child should claim the Carraway legacy. Her voice cracked, eyes glossing over. Albert agreed. He was tired. We were all tired. Alara remained quiet. This was where truth often took its final shape. Then Everett came here, she said carefully, not to demand, but to prove, to present what he had found. Evelyn nodded, voice barely audible. Letters, documents, photographs. He didn't want war, he wanted acknowledgement. Leonard saw it as betrayal, he saw everything at risk. Alara's mind spun through the evidence now mounting with chilling clarity. Everett's arrival under an assumed name, the bruising on the back of his head disguised as a boating mishap. The half-burned will fragment found in the parlor grate, the letter to a solicitor in his bag never posted, and most damning, the disappearance of Roland, the valet, who had been the last to see Everett alive and had fled the estate the very next dawn. Leonard didn't just fear losing the estate, Alara murmured, her voice like silk wrapped around steel. He feared exposure, he feared losing control. Evelyn's face had gone pale. He said if the truth came out, it would undo everything his grandfather built. Alara stood, notebook in hand, now more certain than ever. Everett had not died by accident, he had been silenced with precision. The body hadn't drifted, it had been positioned. The boots had no mud, the coat was unsoaked beneath the surface, and the bruising predated his fall. Leonard had staged the entire scene, but what he didn't know, what would ultimately undo him, was that Everett had already mailed duplicates of the proof to 3 addresses. One had landed directly in Alara's hands just a day prior. And now, as the grandfather clock struck midnight, and the wind howled against the old stone walls, the Carraway legacy trembled on the edge of collapse. Murder, as Alara had always known, was never about the moment of violence. It was about the fear that led up to it, the desperation that followed, and the cracks it left behind. And this house was full of cracks. The Hollowmere Tavern had never known silence quite like this. Not the pleasant kind that lingers in peaceful moments, but the suffocating quiet of a place holding its breath before a storm. Outside, a low fog blanketed the hills, swallowing the cobbled paths in pale mist, while the last light of day bled into darkness behind jagged tree lines. Inside, golden firelight flickered over stone walls, casting shadows that danced like ghosts from another time. Miss Elira Miles stood still for a moment, letting the atmosphere speak before she did. Her eyes swept over the gathering, carefully chosen, subtly summoned, each guest unaware that tonight they were not merely attendees, but participants in a reckoning long overdue. Tobias Whitmore leaned against the bar, trying too hard to look relaxed, though the way his hand tightened around his glass suggested otherwise. His mother, Edith Whitmore, sat upright by the fire, her expression brittle, lips pressed so tightly together they were turning white. Dr. Alden Voss hovered awkwardly by the far window, pretending interest in the rain-specked glass. Constable Reeves stood near the door, arms crossed, gaze quietly alert. A few villagers, Miss Carrow the florist, old Mr. Hollow from the bakery, and young Peter Farrow, whispered among themselves, unaware they held fragments of a puzzle too dark to see until now. Elira began gently, her voice wrapped in casual elegance. "It's strange, isn't it, how tragedy always has such a familiar rhythm, whispers, rumors, silence." She turned toward Miss Carrow, tilting her head. "You were the last to see Nolan Crest alive, weren't you?" The woman blinked, surprised. Yes, I suppose I was. He came into my shop that morning, bought white roses, said they were for someone who deserved truth." Elira nodded, then looked toward Dr. Voss. "And doctor, you examined the body personally, yes? In your official report you noted injuries inconsistent with drowning." Voss swallowed hard. "Yes, there was bruising, fresh, severe, on the temple. It suggested blunt force trauma." A chill swept the room. Tobias stiffened, his fingers now drumming faster. Elira took a sip from her teacup, calm as still water. "It was ruled an accident. But Nolan never should have been near the lake that night, should he, Mr. Whitmore?" Tobias smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're asking dangerous questions, Miss Miles." "On the contrary," she replied smoothly, "I'm only answering them." She set down her cup. "Let me paint a picture, shall I? A young man, quiet, orphaned, but determined, arrives in Hollowmere, with documents no one expected him to possess. He claimed a connection to the Whitmore line, through blood, through birthright. A letter is sent, intended for me. It never arrives. It is later found, half burned in his room's hearth. That same night, he drowns, or so we were told." Now the villagers leaned in, breaths shallow. Elira's tone dropped, no longer polite. "But the bruising tells another story, as do his boots, pristine. No mud, no lake grit, no signs of the steep climb he would have made to reach the shore." Tobias chuckled dryly. "So you think I killed him over an estate? That I staged a drowning to protect my inheritance?" Elira stared at him. "I don't think Mr. Whitmore." "I know." And then Edith broke. Her voice cracked through the silence like a thunderclap. "He came back late. That night," she whispered, barely audible, yet every ear strained to hear. "His shirt soaked, his hands shaking. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He said, 'It's done. No one will find the body until morning.'" Tobias turned to her, his face collapsing inward. "Mother, don't. I saw the ring," she cried, tears now spilling freely. "The old family ring. The one we swore was lost. Nolan wore it. Your grandfather gave it to him before he died. You hated that. You called him a fraud. But he wasn't." Tobias's voice came out hoarse. "He would have taken everything, everything father built. I couldn't let that happen." Elira stepped forward. "So you lured him to the lake under false pretense, struck him from behind, dragged him to the water, weighted his coat with stones. You counted on the current to make it seem accidental." Constable Reeves moved at last, stepping behind Tobias. "Don't," Tobias muttered. "Not yet. I haven't." But it was too late. Elira gave one final statement, her voice cold and surgical. "You forgot the most important thing, Mr. Whitmore. The truth doesn't drown. It surfaces, And just then, young Peter, trembling, wide-eyed, spoke up. "I saw you," he whispered. "That night, by the lake. You dropped something in the water and walked away." Tobias spun, his facade fully shattered. "You little liar." But Reeves was already reaching for his cuffs. Edith sobbed silently, as her son was led through a tavern now filled with horror and revelation. Tobias screamed once more, not in denial, but in rage, at having been exposed. And as the door slammed behind them, Alira Miles stood still, unmoving, her gaze locked on the fire. The flames danced quietly. Justice, long patient, had finally arrived. The parlor of Blackthorn Manor was heavy with dread, a silence so thick it pressed down on every breath, every heartbeat, as if the walls themselves recoiled from the truth that had just been spoken aloud. "I heard your steps, Leonard," Elizabeth said, her voice quivering yet clear. "The way you paced, frantic, like a man breaking from the inside. And I knew what you'd done." Her confession shattered the tension, like a pane of glass struck by a stone. Leonard's face turned a ghastly shade of ash, drained of all color, his lips parting, but no words forming, as if his throat was filled with stone. "You knew," he whispered, his voice cracked and brittle. Elizabeth covered her face with trembling hands, tears threading down her cheeks. "You killed him, Leonard. You killed your own brother." A collective gasp surged through the room, echoing like a chorus of disbelief and horror. Leonard took a staggering step back, his entire world folding in on itself, eyes darting wildly as if the very shadows held accusation. Constable Thorne stepped forward, slow and deliberate, the clinking of his boot buckles the only sound. "Leonard Whitmore," he said with grim finality, "you'll need to come with me." The moment should have ended there, with the confession, with the quiet resolution, but it didn't. In a flash, Leonard snapped. His chair screeched violently against the wooden floor as he bolted upright, shoving past the constable with a suddenness that made villagers recoil. "Stop him," someone cried, but Leonard was already gone, a blur of desperation and guilt crashing through the manor's entrance, and vanishing into the cold fog-wrapped night. Miss Harrow, who had watched the unraveling with still poise, remained seated, her eyes calmly following the open doorway. She knew how truth hunted men like Leonard, unrelenting, patient. Constable Thorne, regaining balance, chased after him, boots hammering against cobblestone, as several others joined the pursuit. Voices called out, feet slipped on the damp street, and for a fleeting moment it seemed Leonard might disappear into the darkness, into legend, but truth has long legs. Minutes later, they returned, Leonard breathless, coat torn, face pale with the kind of defeat that comes not from capture, but from the weight of what can no longer be denied. Thorne fastened the cuffs with quiet efficiency. "Running only makes it worse, lad," he murmured, and Leonard let out a dry, hollow laugh. "Worse than this," he replied, eyes deadened. Miss Harrow studied him, her voice soft but sharp. "Justice, Mr. Whitmore, moves forward, whether you stand, run, or beg. The only choice we have is when we stop lying to ourselves." Leonard held her gaze, and in that flicker of eye contact, something passed between them, resentment, perhaps, or shame. Then he was led away, swallowed by the very fog he had tried to escape into. Inside the manor, Elizabeth let out a breath she had held far too long, her hands trembling as they clutched the armrest like lifelines. Miss Harrow placed a gentle hand atop hers, offering no false comfort, only the stillness that follows truth. "It's over," she said, but they both knew better. Justice ends crimes, not grief. As the others filed out, whispering in hushed disbelief, Miss Harrow remained seated, staring into the hearth's dying embers. Another deception laid bare, another soul shattered by truth. And though the case was closed, she could already feel the next storm building just beneath the surface, where secrets wait. The silence in the grand fading study was like a shroud, thick, suffocating, and heavy with the weight of truth long buried. Eliza Crowell stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on Alfred Doncaster, who now sat slumped in the worn leather armchair, the color draining from his face as if the past itself had reached out and seized him by the throat. Margaret, his sister, trembled near the fireplace, her voice barely more than a breath as she spoke the words that shattered the fragile peace. "It was you, wasn't it, Alfred? You were the last one with Charles by the lake." Alfred flinched, as though her voice carried the very echo of that fatal night. The room seemed to lean inward, as if the walls themselves were listening. Eliza said nothing, she didn't have to. She had seen enough, pieced together the puzzle from every misstep, every contradiction, every frightened glance. Inspector Halford stepped forward slowly, his voice firm and final. "Alfred Doncaster, you are under arrest for the murder of your brother Charles Doncaster." In that moment, Alfred bolted, panic overtook reason, and he lunged toward the door, a blur of desperation and guilt. The scuffle that followed was brief, chaotic, and telling. Halford's men overpowered him at the threshold, dragging him back inside like a man already half consumed by the consequences of his own choices. Eliza remained composed, her expression unreadable. She had seen men like Alfred before, men who mistook inheritance for entitlement, who cloaked their greed in civility until desperation peeled away the mask. The following day, Eliza visited Margaret at the manor. The once proud estate now felt ghostly, hollowed out by years of secrets. Margaret sat near the window, the light casting fragile shadows across her face. "I knew," she confessed, voice brittle. "The night Charles died, Alfred came home soaked, shaking. He said nothing, but his silence said everything." Eliza sat beside her, gently placing a gloved hand atop hers. "Then why didn't you speak?" Margaret swallowed hard, tears threatening to fall. "Because silence felt safer than truth. Because admitting it meant losing everything." Eliza didn't reply immediately. Instead, she let the weight of that statement settle into the room like dust. "But sometimes," she said at last, "silence becomes its own prison, and the longer you dwell within it, the harder it is to escape." That evening, as dusk painted the village in bruised shades of blue and gold, Eliza stood at the edge of the lake, where Charles had died. The surface was calm now, unbothered, as though the water itself had no memory. Yet Eliza knew better. Water held secrets, it just didn't confess them easily. She thought of Charles, of his final moments, of the betrayal he hadn't seen coming until it was too late. She thought of Margaret, broken by the weight of unspoken truth. And she thought of Alfred, so certain he was clever, so sure he could silence guilt with distance. But true crime, Eliza mused, didn't always wear the face of a murderer. It often lingered in the quiet choices, in withheld truths, in the soft betrayals committed out of fear rather than malice. As she turned from the lake, and began walking back toward the quiet heart of the village, one thing was clear: justice had been served, not in grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but in the slow, deliberate unearthing of secrets long thought safe. The next morning was crisp, bright, deceptively ordinary. The village was already humming with life again. Mrs. Fairbanks, at the bakery, was recounting recent events with flour-dusted hands and dramatic flair, while the grocer, Mr. Hemsley, nodded gravely at passers-by, as though he too had known all along. Eliza, composed and immaculate as ever, made her way to the train station, a modest travel bag in hand, and her signature hats set at a respectful angle. At the platform, Inspector Halford waited awkwardly, cap in hand. "Didn't expect your visit to stir up quite so much," he muttered. Eliza offered a gentle smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "I don't stir things up, Inspector, I simply illuminate what's already there." The train whistle pierced the morning air, but before she boarded, she cast one last look over the village, a place where whispers turned into stories, stories into warnings, and every warning was just another beginning. And as the train pulled away, Eliza Crowell vanished into the fog, already carrying the weight of the next unseen crime, because if there was one thing she had learned, it was this: justice never truly slept, and neither did she. Inspector Alistair Haynes stood motionless on the edge of the fog-draped platform, the morning chill curling through the wool of his coat like a whispered warning, as if the very air of Blackmore Edge remembered the darkness it had housed in silence for years. The train was still minutes away, its distant whistle barely piercing the thick silence that blanketed the village in the aftermath of revelation. Opposite him stood Eleanor Stroud, no longer just the grieving widow with trembling hands and a haunted gaze, but a woman reshaped by confrontation, carved open by the truth and stitched back together by the brutal thread of courage. Her eyes, once veiled with quiet compliance, now held a calm storm, a clarity that came only when the illusions people live within had finally shattered. "You've given us peace," she said softly, though the word peace trembled on her lips, uncertain, as if she feared it might dissolve in the light of day. Haynes didn't reply at once. His mind wandered through the dim corridors of Whitcroft Hall, where the scent of old books and older lies still lingered in the drapes. The grandeur of the place had always masked something rotten, something crawling beneath the polished oak floors and the oil portraits with vacant stares. It had taken time, too much time, and far too many overlooked questions, but at last the facade had cracked. Lord Edwin Whitcroft, esteemed nobleman, philanthropist, patron of charities, darling of the press, was now exposed as a predator cloaked in privilege, his crimes buried in silence, covered by influence, protected by fear. But the house could no longer hold its ghosts. A forgotten letter, hidden behind a false drawer in Eleanor's vanity, had been the thread that unraveled decades of abuse, manipulation and guilt. "Justice," Haynes murmured, voice low as if reluctant to awaken the ghosts entirely, "is never swift in places like this, but it's patient, it waits, quietly." Eleanor turned to him, her breath visible in the cold air, her gloved fingers tightening slightly. "They all thought I was imagining things," she whispered. "The strange phone calls, the coded entries in his ledger, the bruises explained away with smiles." Her voice broke for a second, then steadied. "Even I began to think maybe I was just broken." Haynes looked at her, really looked at the strength hiding beneath exhaustion, at the courage born of suffering. "You weren't broken," he said gently. "You were surrounded by people who wanted to keep the truth buried because it was easier than facing it." The screech of the train's brakes echoed through the station as the engine emerged from the mist, its black frame slicing through the gray like a judgment long delayed. Eleanor didn't move. Her eyes scanned the village skyline, the church steeple, the crooked chimney stacks, the tidy fences guarding homes where secrets still lived behind shut curtains. "There'll be more," she said finally, not as a question but a quiet prophecy. "Other towns, other names, other locked rooms and silent halls." Haynes nodded, the weight of it sinking into him. "There always are," he replied. "But stories like yours don't just fade. They leave cracks in the walls, enough for light to get through, enough for someone else to start asking questions." Eleanor took a step toward the open carriage door, pausing once more to look back. "Then promise me you won't stop asking them, even when no one else is willing to listen." Haynes met her gaze, his jaw set with quiet resolve. "I won't. That's the only reason I ever came here." As the train hissed and pulled away, Eleanor watched the village dissolve into mist behind her, a place of smiling masks and whispered doubts, where justice had finally pierced the veil of respectability. And as silence reclaimed the platform and Haynes stood alone once more, one truth echoed louder than any whistle or verdict in every quiet town, beneath every well-kept lawn and polished smile. A secret waits to be unearthed, and someone, somewhere, must always be watching, listening, and ready to pull it into the light.